All right, good morning everybody. Today I'd like to start by reading a sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 19. Pali name for it is Dve Da Vitaka Sutta. It's translated as two kinds of thought. This is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And I think it's an important sutta because it seems to me that it shows an important, maybe an important moment in the Buddha's practice before he attained awakening. Sort of what set him on the path of right view and right intention, and how that led to samadhi and knowledge and liberation. So yeah, definitely a lot of the awakening factors are featured in here. I think of the factors of awakening, Dhammavichaya, investigation of states, investigation of qualities, and samadhi are probably the two that are most highlighted. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied. The Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desire, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty. And I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, and to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana. When I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the affliction of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of sensual desire arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of ill will arose in me. And repeats the same sequence for ill will. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of cruelty arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of cruelty has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, and to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana. When I considered thus, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of cruelty arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of his mind. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of sensual desire, he has abandoned the thought of renunciation to cultivate the thought of sensual desire, and then his mind inclines to thoughts of sensual desire. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of ill will, or upon thoughts of cruelty, he has abandoned the thought of non-cruelty to cultivate the thought of cruelty, and then his mind inclines to thoughts of cruelty. Just as in the last month of the rainy season, in the autumn, when the crops thicken, a cowherd would guard his cows by constantly tapping and poking them on this side and that with a stick to check and curb them. Why is that? Because he sees that he could be flogged, imprisoned, fined, or blamed if he let them stray into the crops. So too, I saw in unwholesome states danger, degradation, and defilement, and in wholesome states the blessing of renunciation, the aspect of cleansing. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of renunciation arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of renunciation has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, does not cause difficulties, and leads to nibbana. If I think and ponder upon this thought, even for a night, even for a day, even for a night and a day, I see nothing to fear from it. But with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body, and when the body is tired, the mind becomes disturbed. And when the mind is disturbed, it is far from concentration. So I studied my mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness, and concentrated it. Why is that? So that my mind should not be disturbed. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of non-ill will arose in me. And it repeats the previous sequence. And the thought of non-cruelty arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of non-cruelty has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, does not cause difficulties, and leads to nibbana. If I think and ponder upon this thought, even for a night, even for a day, even for a night and day, I see nothing to fear from it. But with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body, and when the body is tired, the mind becomes disturbed. And when the mind is disturbed, it is far from concentration. So I studied my mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness, and concentrated it. Why is that? So that my mind should not be disturbed. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of his mind. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of renunciation, he has abandoned the thought of sensual desire to cultivate the thought of renunciation. And then his mind inclines to thoughts of renunciation. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of non-ill will and thoughts of non-cruelty, he has abandoned the thought of cruelty to cultivate the thought of non-cruelty. And then his mind inclines to thoughts of non-cruelty. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops had been brought inside the villages, a cowherd would guard his cows while staying at the root of a tree or out in the open, since he needs only to be mindful that the cows are there. So too, there was need for me only to be mindful that those states were there. Tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled, my mind concentrated and unified. Quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from all unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. With the stilling of applied and sustained thought, I entered upon and abided in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind without applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of concentration. With the fading away as well of rapture, I abided in equanimity, and mindful and fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body, I entered upon and abided in the third jhana, on account of which the noble ones announce, he has a pleasant abiding, who has equanimity and is mindful. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, I entered upon and abided in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. When my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability. I directed it to knowledge of the recollection of past lives. I recollected my manifold past lives, that is, 1 birth, 2 births, 3 births, 4 births, 5 births, 10 births, 20 births, 30 births, 40 births, 50 births, 100 births, 1,000 births, 100,000 births, many aeons of world contraction, many aeons of world expansion, many aeons of world contraction and expansion. There I was so named, of such a clan, with such an appearance, such was my nutriment, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such my life term, and passing away from there I reappeared elsewhere. And there too I was so named, of such clan, with such an appearance, such was my nutriment, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such my life term, and passing away from there I reappeared here. Thus with their aspects and particulars, I recollected my manifold past lives. This was the first true knowledge attained by me in the first watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. When my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, valuable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to knowledge of the passing away and reappearance of beings. With a divine eye which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. I understood how beings pass on according to their actions thus. These worthy beings who were ill-conducted in body, speech, and mind, revilers of noble ones, wrong in their views, giving effect to wrong view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death, have reappeared in a state of deprivation, in a bad destination, in perdition, even in hell. But these worthy beings who were well conducted in body, speech, and mind, not revilers of noble ones, right in their views, giving effect to right view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death have reappeared in a good destination, even in the heavenly world. Thus, with the divine eye which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, and I understood how beings pass on according to their actions. This was the second true knowledge attained by me in the second watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. When my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to knowledge of the destruction of the taints. I directly knew as it actually is, this is suffering. I directly knew as it actually is, this is the origin of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is, this is a cessation of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is, this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is, these are the taints. I directly knew as it actually is, this is the origin of the taints. I directly knew as it actually is, this is the cessation of the taints. I directly knew as it actually is, this is the way leading to the cessation of the taints. When I knew and saw thus, my mind was liberated from the taint of sensual desire, from the taint of being, and from the taint of ignorance. When it was liberated, there came the knowledge, it is liberated. I directly knew birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done, there is no more coming to any state of being. This was the third true knowledge attained by me in the third watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose, darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. Suppose, bhikkhus, that in a wooded range there was a great low-lying marsh near which a large herd of deer lived. Then a man appeared, desiring their ruin, harm, and bondage, and he closed off the safe and good path that led to their happiness. And he opened up a false path, and he put out a decoy and set up a dummy so that the large herd of deer might later come upon calamity, disaster, and loss. But another man came, desiring their good, welfare, and protection, and he reopened the safe and good path that led to their happiness, and he closed off the false path, and he removed the decoy and destroyed the dummy, so that the large herd of deer might later come to growth, increase, and fulfillment. Bhikkhus, I have given this simile in order to convey a meaning. This is the meaning. The great low-lying marsh is a term for sensual pleasures. The large herd of deer is a term for beings. The man desiring their ruin, harm, and bondage is a term for Mara, the evil one. The false path is a term for the wrong eightfold path. That is, wrong view, wrong intention, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong concentration. The decoy is a term for delight and lust. The dummy is a term for ignorance. The man desiring their good, welfare, and protection is a term for the Tathagata, accomplished and fully enlightened. The safe and good path that led to their happiness is a term for the Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So, bhikkhus, the safe and good path that leads to happiness has been reopened by me. The wrong path has been closed off, the decoy removed, the dummy destroyed. What should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and has compassion for them, that I have done for you, bhikkhus. These are the roots of trees, these empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus, do not delay, or else you will regret it later. This is our instruction to you. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So, I really like the similes in the sutta. There's a famous simile about the cowherd guarding his cows in both the before harvest and also after harvest, and that being a simile for the way to look on to both unwholesome and wholesome states of mind. And then the simile of the deer, the herd of deer. Any questions or comments about the sutta? Lumpa, I was kind of wondering if you've thought about this simile of the deer. I know what it's getting at, but the idea of like the deer like in a forest and there's like a marsh and then like a fake path with a dummy, I guess. I don't.
You probably didn't grow up hunting, did you?
No.
Unfortunately, I did. Although I didn't. I grew up in an area where there was a lot of hunting. I didn't actually hunt deer or wolves, but yeah, that's you've got to sort of understand what deer tend to do, and so that if you can, so something like that is you're trying to figure out ways to trick the deer into going where you are, so you can catch them or shoot them.
So like the marsh is like they would go through the marsh or they wouldn't go through the marsh?
Well, they would, but it would make it difficult for them. So then, once they're slowed down, then it's a lot easier to catch them, shoot them.
I see. So the hunter would want to bring them into the marsh.
Yeah.
And then shoot them there. I see.
Yeah.
Just curious, not much of a question, but just if it's stated anywhere, anybody that spoke on, is it something that is seen through the eyes of that life, of the past, or is it seen as a more of an overarching kind of image, like is the experience through the memory of each individual life? What I'm looking for.
In the Word, I don't know because I haven't experienced myself. But from the people who I have had contact with, who have talked about past lives, they see it through those eyes. It's their experience. It's not just a distant. I mean, that's not always true. I mean, sometimes it can be a distant memory. But then also it can be they exist where they inhabit that experience. And that's the recollection of past this experience from a previous life.
Yeah, that's the way it seems to me. And then the divine eye, that seems more, since it's actually dealing with...
Probably with the divine eye, then it's a bit more global, the comprehensive, more looking at
it's actually
from
still
the
happening. It's still happening, so it's more universally accessible. It seems.
Right, I'll read a Dhamma talk by Ajahn Jeff. This one was given in 2006. It's called Energy and Efficiency. There is a famous story of the young man who was very delicately brought up. So delicately brought up that he even had hair on the soles of his feet. When he ordained as a monk, he tried practicing meditation really hard, sitting long periods of time, doing walking meditation long periods of time. But because his feet were so tender, all that walking got his feet bloody. He thought to himself, here I've given all the effort I can and nothing is coming of it. He thought of disrobing. The Buddha sensed this and appeared right in front of him and asked him, back when you were a layperson, did you play the lute? The monk said he had. He was skilled at playing the lute. And the Buddha asked him, when you tightened the strings too tight, what happened? It didn't sound right at all. How about too loose? Didn't sound right either. And the Buddha then said, in the same way, you should tune your energy to the point where it's just right, and then tune the rest of the strings of your practice. In other words, conviction, mindfulness, concentration, discernment. Tune those to the level of your energy. In that way, the practice will come out right. So keep this in mind as you're meditating. Look at the level of energy you have. This can be both physical and mental energy. And tune your practice to that level. Everything else has to be tuned to that. In other words, when you're sick, when you're not feeling well, the practice goes one way. You may spend less time putting physical energy into the practice, and you may not be able to gain the levels of concentration or very precise mindfulness that you want, but do the best you can given the circumstances. When your energy level is high, don't be too quick to say, well, I've meditated enough. It's 11 o'clock, that's my usual time to go to bed. I'll go to bed then. When your energy level is high, stick with it. Tune your practice to the level of energy that you have. And do what you can to increase the energy. This is one of the roles of right mindfulness, gaining a sense where you're doing the practice inefficiently. It's like increasing the gas mileage on your car. You may have a limited amount of gas, but if the car is more efficient, you can go further. So try to do the practice as efficiently as you can. Look for areas where you're causing yourself unnecessary stress, placing unnecessary obstacles in your way. Clear those away. This is where mindfulness and discernment come in. Mindfulness here, including alertness, watching to see what's going on, how things are going with your practice. Use them to look for areas where you're expending wasted energy. There was once a woman, a student of Ajahn Fuang, who had chronic cancer. It was amazing. She would get cancer on one part of the body, they take that out, then she found it in another part of the body. This went on for years and years. As far as I know, she is still alive. This started 20 plus years ago. One time she developed a form of cancer that required radiation, but she was allergic to the anesthesia. So she told the doctors, "Look, I'm a meditator. I can handle pain. Let me just use my power of concentration." So they tried it and she got through, but it took all her energy and left her feeling drained. But she was able to make it through without any anesthesia. Ajahn Fuang went to visit her the next day, and as she told him this, he said, "Look, you're wasting your energy. Try to use your discernment too." In other words, get a sense of what's awareness as opposed to the object of awareness. And keep that distinction in mind. Just being able to make that distinction makes it a lot easier to deal with the pain. You don't have to use simply the brute force of your concentration. So an important principle in discernment is learning what to let go of so that you're not wasting energy. This is especially important as you find yourself physically ill, as you grow old, as you approach death. A lot of wasted energy gets spent in your idea of who you are and what you're responsible for, and what you want to salvage out of all of this. If you can remind yourself that the important thing to salvage is the state of your mind, keeping the mind as bright and centered and clear as possible, then you can come through a lot more intact. That's your responsibility. Everything else is optional. So even though you may have been identifying with your body, you find there comes a point where it's an unnecessary burden. You may have gotten some use out of identifying with it, but there comes a point in the practice where that becomes an obstacle to any kind of happiness. So before that point comes, you want to learn how to let go, realizing that any concern about the physical state of the body is ultimately going to have to meet up with the fact that the body has to grow old and ill and die, regardless of how worried you are about it. So the worry accomplishes nothing. It becomes a distraction and an unnecessary burden. This is where it's important that you learn how to adjust your sense of who you are and trim it down. It's like trimming down your luggage. You know you're going to have to travel, so carry only what's necessary. It's like going camping. You don't want to carry so much that you can't walk. And at the same time, you don't want to have so few possessions, so few provisions, that you can't keep yourself going. To begin with, make sure you just hold on to this ability to be mindful and alert. Get your concentration as solid as you can. In other words, hold on to good qualities. As for your other responsibilities, you have to keep practicing letting them go. Whatever work you've got to do, whatever responsibilities you've got to look after, learn how to let any ideas of those responsibilities down. Learn how to disidentify with the body. You may have to pick it up again at the end of meditation, but for the time being, just learn how to reflect on it. What in here is something that you can really carry with you, that's really worth carrying with you? It's all physical elements. That list of the 32 parts of the body we chanted just now. Which of those do you want to take with you? They serve their function while the body is alive, but you'll have to let them all go. Besides, who would want to carry urine around, or feces, or contents of the stomach or lungs? They're useful while the body's alive, and you want to take care of the body so that it can continue functioning as best it can. But there will come a time when it just can't do this anymore. So learn how to practice letting it go ahead of time, putting it down. At the very least, you find this is a lot more efficient way of keeping the mind calm, keeping the mind still, clear, bright. It's in this way that discernment is an issue of maximizing efficiency, husbanding your resources, learning what to let go of so you can hold on to what's valuable. If you try to hold on to too many things at once, you end up dropping them all. It's like juggling too many things in the air all at once. If they're eggs, they'll come splattering down because you can't keep track of them all. Juggle what you can manage. If you can manage one egg, stick with one egg. Don't get too grandiose about what you've got to look after. Keep things trimmed down, pared down, so that you're only holding on to what's essential. That way you find that the issue of suffering and stress gets more manageable as well. Any comments or questions? One other talk we'll read part of. This is called The Thinking Cure. This was also given in 2006. And I think he's referencing the sutta that I read. The Buddha once said that he got started on the right path of practice when he learned to observe his thinking, noticing which kinds of thoughts were skillful, which kinds were unskillful. In other words, which kinds of thinking lead to harm, which kinds of thinking didn't lead to harm. Notice that he didn't say he got on the path when he learned to stop thinking. He got on the path when he learned to observe his thinking and to see it as part of a causal process. This is important because a lot of meditation has to do with thinking. There's a popular misconception that meditation means not thinking at all. But if you look at all the descriptions of the Noble Eightfold Path, you see that they all start with right view. Then they continue with right resolve. In other words, they start with thinking, learning how to think in the right way. This is why we have Dhamma talks. If thinking weren't involved in the practice, if your views weren't important in the practice, Dhamma talks wouldn't serve any function. You'd have to teach by example and by not saying anything at all. But meditation doesn't work that way. You have to learn how to think in the right way as you come to meditation. This is a thinking cure. In psychotherapy, they have talking cures, and they note how amazing it is. Sometimes simply talking over a neurosis, getting it out in the open, learning to be very clear about the presuppositions behind it, can disband it. It loses its power. In a similar vein, meditation is learning how to watch our thoughts, to be very clear about how the mind thinks, learning how to bring up its assumptions, the unexpressed assumptions or the ones just barely expressed, so that you can see them in the light of day. Then you can see what kinds of thinking you really do believe in, what kinds of thinking you don't. Often you'll find that the things that have been having the most power over the mind are the ones that, if you really look at them, don't really make any sense at all. So it's important as you meditate that you have a sense of the role and power of thinking in the meditation. For example, as we're doing breath meditation, try to get the mind to settle down with the breath, get concentrated on the breath. As the Buddha said, every state of concentration depends on a perception, a mental label you create, a little message you can carry from one moment to the next, one that you can remember, that you can be mindful of. Here that message is breath. So what is your concept of the breath? How do you relate to it? We talk about forcing the breath, but the breath isn't the sort of thing you can force. You can force the blood to different parts of your body, and that's often what we do when we think we're moving the breath around in the body. We're simply changing the way the blood circulates. We can get ourselves into some pretty strange physical states this way, and they can have an effect on the mind because you're forcing the blood too much. In other words, you're playing around with what the texts call the liquid element, or the liquid property, and you've missed the breath entirely. But this is the way we often relate to our body. An emotion comes up, and a lot of the physical side of the emotion has to do with the fact that our blood circulation has changed. When we were little children, before we learned any language, we ran up against pain, and one of the ways we dealt with it was to try to force it away. We actually used a change in the blood circulation to try to force the pain away. That became our instinctive way of relating to the body, to force the blood to circulate in a different way. This is why so much of the imagery of psychotherapy is from hydraulic mechanics. Emotions get pushed underground and then they force their way here, force their way there, the same way that liquids under pressure get forced around or break the pipes. But as a meditator, you've got to realize that there are other ways of relating to the energy in the body. In fact, the only way you can really get in touch with the breath is to reconceive the whole way you relate to the body. The best way to deal with the breath is simply to think, allow. Think of the breath going down the back. You don't push it down the back, you allow it to go. When you think of the breath going to the different parts of the body, don't try to push it. You allow it. If you push it, you're pushing the blood, you're pushing the liquids in the body. What you can do is just think, open up, open up. Keep your wrists relaxed, keep your ankles relaxed, all your joints, keep them relaxed. Think of opening up the passages by which the breath can flow. You can't make the breath flow. It's something it's going to do on its own once you've opened the channels. So you maintain the thought of just breath. You might want to picture the body and say, think of breath going down the back, out the legs, down the shoulders, out the arms, spreading out in all directions. You can keep that picture, that perception in mind, but try not to force anything in the body. As soon as you start forcing things, it gets difficult. This is part of the thinking cure, getting a new conception of the breath and learning how to hold on to that conception. And you need a new conception of yourself as well, of what you can do. Often this is a huge part of the meditation. I remember looking through the collections of Dhamma talks from the forest ajahns, and this applies to all of them. So much of their talks is spent not in explaining things, but in encouraging. Reminding people that this is something you can do. You can relate to the body in a different way from the way you've been doing it. You can relate to the mind in a different way. As the Buddha once said, if it weren't possible for people to change their ways from unskillful to skillful, he wouldn't have taught the practice of developing skill. It wouldn't have served any purpose. But it is possible. When you've been doing something unskillful, you can change. You realize that there is another way of doing things and that you're capable of doing it. This requires a certain amount of imagination. That's the beginning of any change in your behavior. Allowing yourself to imagine that you can change the way you behave. This is another part of the thinking cure. This applies to all aspects of the practice. You start with generosity. When you make up your mind to give a gift, you're imagining yourself as someone with something to spare. Up to that point, you may have been thinking that you're hungry and lacking, and all you could think about was gaining, getting. But when you allow yourself to think that you have more than enough, you can give. And you begin to realize that this has very little to do with how much you have materially. Poor people can often be more generous than rich people because they have a different idea of enough. When you make this simple change in your thinking, you put yourself in a new place. A place with more dignity, a place of inner worth. The gift of forgiveness is the same sort of thing. Someone else has harmed you. If all you can think about is how much you're a victim, you make yourself a smaller person. But if you think of yourself as large-hearted enough to forgive, you suddenly become a larger person. That gives the mind more space to move around. And so on down the line. You learn that you can observe the precepts, you learn that you can meditate, simply by changing the way you think about yourself and your capabilities. So remember that this is a thinking cure. There do come parts of the practice where you're learning not to think, but you have your reasons for not thinking. You're doing it with specific aims in mind. So be clear about your aims and where your aims come from. What are the values that lie behind them? What's your understanding of suffering and the end of suffering that lies behind how you do things? Make sure to straighten out your thoughts. Once you straighten out your thoughts, realizing how suffering comes about and how you can put an end to it, you've got everything you need to put an end to it. It's simply a matter of allowing yourself to think in those ways. Notice that the emphasis is on allowing. You don't have to force yourself. You allow something better than what has been happening to happen. Ajahn Fuang once said that if we could force our way into Nibbana, everybody would have arrived there a long time ago. But it's not something you can do by force. You ultimately get there only through discernment. And discernment starts with learning how to think in the right way. It doesn't cost anything, doesn't require a lot of energy, just allowing yourself to think in skillful ways. That can turn you around right there and head you in the right direction. So before you stop thinking, learning how to think in ways that are really helpful, allow yourself to think in ways that are really helpful, and it will make all the difference in your practice. Any comments or questions?
That was a great talk.
Yeah, I like that paradigm of the duties, like within the wholesome, like the framework of the wholesome and unwholesome, but then the duties within it.
You mean in the sutta or in Ajahn?
No, in that talk right there, he starts off saying there's wholesome and others, like we meditate, it's not just to end thought, but there's duties within the practice.
All right, well, it's about 10:30. It's probably enough.